Good afternoon. Amid rising tensions, the United Nations Interim Force, or UNIFIL, in Lebanon faces unprecedented challenges as Israeli occupation forces repeatedly target their positions. Recent attacks have left peacekeepers injured, raising alarms over potential violations of international law. The situation reflects a dangerous intersection of military aggression and humanitarian duty as Israel intensifies operations against Hezbollah. This episode delves into the motives behind these assaults, the implications for Lebanon's stability, and the broader consequences of international peacekeeping efforts in a region fraught with conflict. Welcome to In Depth.
كل المستهدفين هن مدنيين.
الوضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
On October the 11th, yesterday, Western leaders, including Emmanuel Macron and Joe Biden, condemned Israeli strikes on the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon that injured 4 peacekeepers. French newspaper Le Monde has stated that Macron labelled the targeting of UN troops as totally unacceptable and warned France would not tolerate further aggression. In a joint statement, France, Italy and Spain emphasized the need to protect peacekeepers and praised UNIFIL's essential role. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres deemed the attacks of a violation of international humanitarian law, while Biden firmly stated his demand for Israel to cease fire on UN. UNIFIL peacekeepers find themselves under increasing threat. On October the 10th, an Israeli tank attack on an observation tower in Naqoura injured 2 peacekeepers, raising alarms about Israel's aggressive military stance. With neighboring positions under fire, the safety of those tasked with maintaining peace is increasingly jeopardized, signaling a potential shift in regional conflict dynamics. International condemnation is mounting, highlighting the urgent need for safeguarding humanitarian principles amidst escalating tensions.
In the wake of escalating violence in southern Lebanon, United Nations peacekeeping forces UNIFIL are facing increasing danger. On October 10th, an Israeli tank fired on an observation tower at UNIFIL's headquarters in Naqoura, injuring 2 peacekeepers. This attack was not an isolated incident. It followed another strike just a day earlier as part of a broader wave of aggression, raising alarms and questions about Israel's military posture in the region and its motives. UN Peacekeeping Chief Jean-Pierre Lacroix described the situation as increasingly grave, noting that the safety and security of peacekeepers is now in jeopardy.
UNIFIL peacekeepers continue to do their best to implement their Security Council mandate in obviously very difficult conditions.
The attack on the observation tower was not isolated. Nearby UNIFIL positions have also been targeted, signaling a troubling pattern that undermines the principles of international humanitarian law. As part of a broader regional strategy, condemnation poured in from nations like Italy, France, and Ireland, whose troops served in the UN mission. Their statements echoed a growing concern. These assaults not only endanger peacekeepers, but also suggests a potential shift in Israeli tactics, possibly targeting Lebanon as a whole, rather than just Hezbollah. As the conflict intensifies, its implications reach far beyond the battlefield, casting a long shadow over the region's fragile peace and stability. The targeting of UNIFIL forces raising critical questions about the enforcement of international law and the safety of those tasked with maintaining the peace amid the chaos.
Now to discuss this with us, joining us from occupied Jerusalem, Monir Nasiba, a professor of international law, and from Beirut, Saeed Al-Qaza, a strategic expert. Welcome to you both. I'll start with you, Professor Nasiba. Could you provide an overview of the legal framework governing the operations of UNIFIL forces in Lebanon and the implications of these repeated Israeli attacks?
Yes. The UNIFIL forces in the south of Lebanon have been mandated by the United Nations Security Council back in the late 70s, in 1978, but also again in a new resolution in 2006. These forces are peacekeeping forces that are supposed to observe the border, to observe any breach of the ceasefire that was decided then, and to report back to the United Nations. Peacekeeping forces should not be targeted by any of the conflicting parties. The fact that the Israeli army has targeted these forces more than once now is an assault, first on the United Nations, but also on international humanitarian law, which regulates, it regulates the way that states conduct war and the type of targets that are admissible by international law. And this is not admissible. Hitting and targeting UN forces, peacekeeping forces, is a grave breach of international humanitarian law, which means that it is a war crime.
Thank you for that, Professor. And now to Beirut, Saeed Al-Qazza. How do you view the recent Israeli attacks on UNIFIL forces, and what do you think might be the implications for peacekeeping operations in Lebanon?
Good evening, sir. Good evening, dear audience. Targeting the peacekeeping forces working in South Lebanon is a great breach of the international humanitarian law. It's also a violation of Resolution 1701, one that grants the peacekeeping forces operating in South Lebanon the mandate to support the Lebanese army to maintain peace and stability and security and evacuate the area from the armed people. The Israeli enemy forces commits only crimes and massacres, war crimes and crimes against humanity. Also, their aggression against the peacekeeping forces is a war crime that it should be held accountable for in the International Court of Justice.
And going back to you, Professor Nasiba, how do these repeated Israeli strikes against UNIFIL forces reflect on the legality of their military targets, Israel's military targets, within the context of international law, in which you're an expert?
Thank you very much for your very good question, actually. The targeting of UN forces could not have happened if Israel has not enjoyed full impunity for all the attacks that it has been implementing against the civilian population, both in Lebanon and, of course, in Palestine, in the Gaza Strip and other locations. The fact that Israel has, until today, not been sanctioned by the UN Security Council, and of course there are the UN's General Assembly has decided sanctions, and there are certain individual countries that have actually started to sanction Israel in many different ways. But the fact that these sanctions are still very limited means that Israel can continue to breach international law, breach the orders of the International Court of Justice, and feel secure, and feel that these crimes and these violations will not bring about any consequences for the state of Israel. So I would actually, and by the way, this is not the only attack now against the UN. Israel has also decided to prohibit the work of the United Nations Agency for Palestine Refugees, the UNRWA, in parts of Palestine, including occupied Jerusalem. And until now, all we hear is condemnations and criticism. In some cases, even this criticism is very shy. As long as there is no accountability for violations and for crimes, Israel will continue to breach international law, will continue with the genocide, will continue ignoring the UN and blaming the UN and all of its legal experts and human rights rapporteurs that Israel will continue to blame all of them instead of abiding by its international law obligations.
So the professor says that it's not just
could add-
happening in Lebanon, it's also happening where he is as well. Mr. Al-Qazza, what do you believe are the motivations behind Israel's repeated attacks on UN forces?
Sir, I'd like to add that there was an incident in 1996. So it's not the first time that the Israeli forces attacked the UN premises and they were not held accountable. In 1996, the enemy forces struck a center for UNIFIL, where the displaced people took shelter in that place, and Qana massacre took place. If many of your audience remember it, Qana massacre resulted in 200 martyrs. I witnessed this firsthand. I contributed in the work of transferring the corpse of dead people and the children and so on. So the United Nations warned UNIFIL to move away from the borders and leave their centers in the blue line in order to have a freedom in the movement. If they decided to invade the south of Lebanon, or a ground offensive, of course. So these places do not allow the UNIFIL to prevent the Israeli forces from moving forward with their military power, because the mandate given to UNIFIL or the emergency forces, they were granted these mandates by Resolution 1701 in 2006, which stipulates to apply or implement security with the economic sanctions, dialogue, and so on. Chapter 7, that mandates the emergency forces, does not allow them to use power to impose peace. So the Israeli enemy now does not want to have any eyewitness for the things they do. That's why they ask the emergency forces to withdraw from the borders and from their centers on the blue line. When the emergency forces didn't respond and refused this, they started to harass their centers to say that UNIFIL or these emergency forces are exposed to being fired or struck, and that's why they have to withdraw to protect their soldiers.
Thank you for that, and your personal experience there sounds particularly harrowing. Professor Nasiba, a similar question to you. What are the potential motives, do you think, behind Israel's increased military actions in Lebanon and also where you are as well? Why do they do this? What's their game?
Unfortunately, in the Gaza Strip, the plan has been clear. Israel started massively displacing Palestinians from the north of the Strip to the south. They are trying to displace the Palestinians outside the Gaza Strip totally and outside Palestine. There are a lot of campaigns, including by governmental officials, who want to build settler colonies for Israel in the Gaza Strip. Unfortunately, I'm observing a very similar pattern in the south of Lebanon. As we could see during the past period, Israel is continuing to displace the Lebanese civilian population in masses towards the north. It is making sure that the Lebanese population does not feel safe in their homes. And there are also campaigns for settlements colonial settlements in Lebanon. So unfortunately, my fear is that it's not only using this force, this genocidal force in both areas, only to show that they are powerful and to win a war, but I'm afraid that they are also working towards their colonial objectives quite actively.
And Mr. Alcazar, in your opinion, do these attacks constitute violations of international law? Of course, you've mentioned Resolution 1701. And what do you think is going to be done about it?
Yes, I also mentioned that these attacks are a violation of the international humanitarian law. Yes, I also said that the Israeli enemy should be brought to court for attacking the UNIFIL forces in the International Court of Justice. Yes, these are violations. To respond to what your dear guest said regarding his fears and concerns, I'd like to reassure him that the Israeli forces cannot build any settlements in south of Lebanon, because if this is their intention and they want to realize this, then the whole Lebanese people will unify behind the Lebanese army and the Lebanese state in order to defend Lebanon and to expel Israelis from the Lebanese territories. We watched this before when the whole Lebanese people were unified before the year 2000. The Israeli enemy When the Israeli enemy occupied the south of Lebanon, so under the strikes, they had to withdraw. And if now they want to build colonies in southern Lebanon, I think all of these are dreams that cannot come true, because then the whole Lebanese people will be supporting the Lebanese state and the Lebanese army, and the enemy forces will never manage to stay in the south of Lebanon. That's what I want to reassure your guest with.
Okay, well, thank you very much to both of you for your input so far, but please stay with me. We're going to come back and we're going to discuss this a little bit more. First of all, let's take a short break to have an examination of Israeli strikes against the UN. And now we'll go back to our discussion. I'm joined by Munir Nasiba, a professor of international law in occupied Jerusalem, and also from Beirut, Saeed Al-Qazar, a strategic expert, and both are still here with me. We're going to be talking about the international response to this in just a second, but let's start by broadening it out just a little bit. Can you, Professor Nasiba, discuss the implications of Israel's actions against civilians, including attacks on schools and refugee camps, in light of international humanitarian law?
Yes, international humanitarian law only allows parties at war to target military targets. Any other target would be in breach of international law. The way we are observing the Israeli way in conducting its military operations, both in the Gaza Strip and in Lebanon, we have noticed a very wide-scale targeting of civilians, as well as other civilian targets, hospitals, schools, universities, etc. This each one of these actions is considered a war crime. The fact that they are widespread and systematic makes it a crime against humanity. And unfortunately, as a result of the intention of Israel to destroy the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, as it has been examined by the International Court of Justice, it actually amounts to genocide. And genocide is actually the worst and gravest crime in the dictionary of international law. But Israel is indeed conducting this crime currently in the Gaza Strip. So the consequences of these acts should be, first, that a number of individuals should be held accountable for their criminal intention. Every person who participated and contributed to these crimes should be prosecuted and punished for their crimes. But also Israel must repair all the damages that are reparable to all the victims of its violations as a result of these crimes.
And to you, Mr. Al-Qaza in Beirut, you can comment on that as well. And also, how do you view these aggressions and their influence in the broader security situation in Lebanon?
Of course, the Israeli forces violate the international humanitarian law. Your dear guest is an expert in this matter. He explained this better. But let me give you an example on an incident took place in Lebanon, the major explosion. Even if they belong to Hezbollah, who are militias or armed individuals, they are at their homes. The international humanitarian law prohibits the attacking forces or the forces at war to fire or shoot against any soldier who surrenders in the field or puts their arms down, or if they are injured, let alone being in their homes with their families among the civilians. This is a war crime. I said this since the very first moment. It's a war crime that the occupation Israeli state should be prosecuted before the International Court of Justice and the different international courts. The leaders and those who gave the orders should be held accountable and be prosecuted for this. Most of what Israel does is war crimes, including targeting the medical professional, ambulances and hospitals. All of this, they even targeted the civilians themselves. If there is a fighter in a building or in his house, when they target this fighter and kill 25 people else, it's a war crime. You asked me about the security situation. The security situation internally is still cohesive. There are no incidents among the displaced people or among the citizens or the individuals, because the Lebanese army took over and controls. And the safe areas to which the southern people resorted to, they were warmly welcomed in their houses, schools, churches, and mosques. They are our brothers in this country. They are the sons of the same homeland. We will never let them go. In Lebanon, we are different and disagree regarding the policy, but we are unified in our stance towards Israel.
Thank you for that. That gives us a clear Professor Nasiba. What do you think of the response of the international community to these Israeli violations? Of course, we mentioned earlier on about Macron's response. President Biden has said that he is absolutely and positively urging Israel to stop these attacks on peacekeepers. Do you believe this kind of response is adequate or effective?
Not at all. This type of response is certainly not adequate. And this type of response is exactly what will encourage Israel to do its next attack on UN peacekeeping forces and its next attack on civilians, and will continue violating international law in the same way that it has been doing for decades. Mere criticism that is not combined with any sanctions, with any action, is actually meaningless. When the Biden administration criticizes Israel for violations of international law without actually necessarily even calling them violations of international law or war crimes, and at the same time continuing to fund the Israeli army, to provide it with weapons, to provide it with all the needs to continue these crimes. In that sense, the United States is actually only encouraging the continuation of these crimes.
Okay, I'm going to break in there because we're running out of time, and I wanted to give Saeed Al-Qaza an opportunity to give his view as well.
The international community should take practical steps and effective steps. I'd like to provide an example on this. In 1986, when the Popular Front exploded the Israeli airplanes, the Israeli forces struck Beirut airport and damaged 12 airplanes for the Lebanese airlines. At that time, General de Gaulle, as far as I remember, and I think he was the French president at that time, he cut the ties with Israel and imposed sanctions on Israel. And he took a strict situation or a stance. The international community should take more strict actions towards the state of Israel, the Zionist enemy. They should stop them.
Okay, I've just been told we do have a little bit more time, so I apologize for interrupting you, Professor Nasiba. Another question for you, Professor. How effective has UNIFIL been in protecting civilians and securing borders, and how much more difficult will it be for them to do that now?
It hasn't been effective in protecting civilians, in fact. It does not really have any fighting mandate in where it's working now in the south of Lebanon. It only observes the violations of any of the two parties at war on the UN Security Council resolutions, and that's it. So they have not really contributed into protecting civilians from the strikes that Israel has been conducting since the beginning of this offensive and aggression on Lebanon.
And Mr. Al-Qaza, given the current situation, what do you foresee as the future role of UN peacekeeping forces in Lebanon?
In the future, I can only foresee that Resolution 1701 should be implemented literally by the widespread of the Lebanese army to support the UNIFIL forces in south of Lebanon and to evacuate Litani's southern area from all the militias or illegal militias. So any armed phenomena that are not affiliated to the Lebanese state should be evacuated from that area. Resolution 1701 stipulates that all the relevant international resolutions, including 1680, should be implemented. So all the Lebanese militias and non-Lebanese militias should be dissolved and their weapons should be submitted to the Lebanese army. And according to the Lebanese constitution, that stipulates that the ownership, the use, and the use of weapons should be only conducted by the Lebanese army. Lebanon can only be freed by the implementation of the Lebanese constitution. Then the peacekeeping forces can exist with their supportive role, and in this case they can be leveraged better. I'd like to tell you that since 2006 and up till now, the UNIFIL forces do developmental actions in southern Lebanon and with their local people, and they play an active role in this regard.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for being on the program. It's been a fascinating discussion. Munir Nasiba, a professor of international law, and Saeed Al-Qazah, a strategic expert in Beirut. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us on the program. Now, as the echoes of artillery fade, the plight of UNIFIL forces underscores a grim reality. The Israeli illegal military targets and international law violations threaten Lebanon's fragile peace and regional stability, leaving scars on both land and humanity. That brings us to the end of today's episode of In Depth. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes on Q News. Thanks for watching.